Hello, I'm Dale Matchak, Chairman of the Econ program at Northwood University and Director of Northwood University's Freedom Seminar. Welcome to everyone who's joining us this afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce to you our featured speaker on the topic of intersectionality and the socialist temptation. This is Dr. Elizabeth Corey, who is Professor of Political Science at Baylor University. Dr. Corey received her doctorate from Louisiana State University in political science, and she also has a surprisingly diverse background, master's degree in art history and a bachelor's degree in classics from Oberlin College. She's also the director of the honors program at Baylor University. She has frequently appeared in First Things, where she serves on the board, The Atlantic, the Chronicle of Higher Education, National Affairs, and of course many scholarly journals. She has also published Michael Oakeshott, Religion, Aesthetics, and Politics, and is the co-editor of Radical Conservatism book series published by the University of Pennsylvania Press. She's an award-winning teacher and was the recipient of the 2016 Robert Novak Journalism Fellowship. She is here today to present to us a topic of important and interest to me as an academic and to many of us. You heard this morning, if you joined us for Michael Tanner's lecture, that speaking the language of intersectionality is important for communicating with people of different political persuasions. And so I hope we can all learn from her. Welcome, Dr. Corey.
Thank you. Great to be here. Well, I have been asked to talk about intersectionality, and just a little bit of background. I wrote the article that I am drawing from here today back in 2016, 2017, and at that time, very few people were talking in the wider sort of academic intellectual world about intersectionality. And 5 years out, I'm guessing that you all, everybody in this seminar, is pretty familiar with the term and probably with what it means. But I think nevertheless, it does not hurt to just kind of set out the origins and talk a little bit about what's going on with intersectionality and really why it's the fundamental idea that underlies so much that goes on in the academy, so much that now goes on in arts and administration and government and companies, across the spectrum of interests. So it's worth looking into the origins. So what I'll do today is spend a little bit of time talking about, okay, where did this idea come from? What does it mean? And then I'm going to level some criticisms because I think that it is an idea that needs to be criticized. So I think we might just start with the very beginnings. The question, what is intersectionality? And I think everybody at this point has an idea, but we'll go ahead and go through the origins of it. It was coined only, 30 years ago, or a little more than 30 years ago, in 1989, by a legal scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw in one of those articles that is so fundamental it's been cited thousands of times. And she wrote a piece in the University of Chicago Legal Forum, and that piece was called Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black Feminist Critique of Anti-Discrimination Doctrine, Feminist Theory, and Anti-Racist Politics. It's a long title, but it's an important article. And in that article, she makes a case for treating race and gender not as separate legal categories, but as engendering a new combined category. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, in other words, while a woman can claim discrimination on the basis of sex, and let's say a Black man might claim it on the basis of race, neither race nor sex alone could capture the discrimination endured by a Black woman. In other words, they're saying there's a new category that carries with it a unique set of harms that cannot be captured by a single vector or a single mode of oppression. So she explains, Crenshaw, the author of this article, explains what she means by taking up several concrete legal cases. And there were several in the article, but I'll just talk about one here. The most vivid, I think, example of intersectionality is de Graaf and Reed versus General Motors. And what happened there is that 5 black women sued GM for discrimination. The situation was that GM hadn't hired black women prior to 1964 and had dismissed all its black female employees after 1970. So the plaintiffs, a group of black women, claimed the harm they suffered couldn't be captured by suing as women only, because GM could point out that it had hired white women prior to 1964. Women had been hired. They happened to be white, but they were hired, and that it kept them after 1970. So the plaintiffs were also unwilling to sue on the basis of race alone, because they said, GM came back with the same kinds of comments about having black men in positions prior to 1964 and after 1970. So they said their unique position was a result of the combination of race and sex, and that they were being harmed specifically as black women. Now, the court ultimately rejects this claim, and the court says we're not going to go down this road. But that is less important. The decision in this is less important than the fact that this article started the field of thinking about intersectionality as the combination of usually disadvantageous traits. The part of the reason the court rejected the claim is it said this: the creation of new classes of protected minorities governed only by the mathematical principles of permutation and combination clearly raises the prospect of opening a Pandora's box. But Crenshaw was not wrong to point out that these women were clearly suffering from a disadvantage that was unique to them and couldn't be captured by a single category of race or sex. And this is where the metaphor of intersectionality is born. And if you could, I think I have someone who is helping me with my slides. If you could go down 2 slides, there's an image of an intersection, and I'd like to show that to the audience. It says, "What is intersectionality?" So I'm giving you an image here of a person in the middle of an intersection. And what this is meant to show is that in the original article of Crenshaw, black women find themselves at the intersection of 2 different kinds of prejudice. One is race and one is sex, and they can receive justice or remedy by pursuing neither identity alone. So the 2 aspects of identity actually intersect. And so the person standing in the middle of the intersection, as you can see there, is harmed from 2 different directions. There are 2 vectors of harm. Now, this sounds commonsensical, but you will know, if you know anything at all about intersectionality, just sort of from common knowledge, there are many more than 2 possible disadvantageous traits. So it's not now that a person may be a combination of 2 traits, race and sex, but every person is a combination of an infinite number of traits. So let me give you Crenshaw's explanation of what's going on in this intersection. He says, consider an analogy to traffic in an intersection, coming and going in all 4 directions. Discrimination, like traffic through an intersection, may flow in one direction, and it may flow in another. If an accident happens in an intersection, it can be caused by cars traveling from any number of directions, and sometimes from all of them. Similarly, if a black woman is harmed because she is in the intersection, her injury could result from sex discrimination or race discrimination. So the point is, I think, as Crenshaw wants to explain it, traditional notions of discrimination employ a but-for analysis. In other words, a white woman would be treated just like a white man, but for her sex. But the black woman is not simply harmed by the one vector of discrimination. And also, it is not just that a black woman is discriminated against in these 2 ways, but that the combination of these negative identities, being black and being a woman, produces a categorically different identity still. For instance, Crenshaw points out that patriarchal ideas applying to white women often do not apply to black women. For example, that their chastity must be guarded. Crenshaw says that is not so much an issue for black women as it is for white women. And then she points out that many black women are oppressed by patriarchy inherent in black culture itself. Therefore, equating black women's experiences just simply with white women or with black men is to make a mistake. So you can see where this is going. a Black woman who is a lesbian would have an even more differentiated experience, and a disabled Black lesbian woman still more. So what you get in the end, and we'll talk more about this as we go on, is a kind of hierarchy of discrimination, so that there is a point of greatest privilege and there is a point of severe oppression. And we know who the greatest privilege holders are, and those are white men. And then the levels of oppression go down sort of from there. White women are one removed from white men. Black men are one removed from white women, and so on and so forth. Well, I'll give you some other images for that. If I could go to the next slide, I want to show you another visual image of what's going on in intersectionality. So what you should see here is a series of overlapping circles, and each of these circles has a disadvantage, a potential disadvantage. Disability, race, sexual orientation, gender identity, nationality, and there could be many more of these bubbles as we go on. You'll see the next image shows similar vectors, even more of oppression. But the point is that you can have one of these, but you might have overlapping disadvantages. And if you are extremely far down the intersectional oppression level, you might be right in the middle of all those circles. Or you could have any combination of them. And if you would click one more slide, you're going to see a very interesting image. It's called Intersecting Axes of Privilege, Domination, and Oppression. And you can see there that there are these lines going through sort of a horizontal axis, and everything above is thought to be an advantage, a measure of privilege, and everything below is a measure of disadvantage or of oppression. And you can locate yourself along these axes depending on who you are, what your various characteristics are. There are many ways of visualizing this. There's also, if you would click down two more slides, there is something called the intersectionality score calculator. Maybe some of you have had some familiarity with this before. It is a way you can actually test your intersectional level of privilege or oppression. You go in and you answer, or you position yourself. I can't remember if I haven't done the test in a while, but you can figure out on a level, on a scale of 1 to 100, how privileged or how oppressed are you? And it's an interesting exercise because it shows you that there are certain vectors that are important and others that are not asked about at all, such as religious affiliation and political affiliation. None of that stuff is taken into account on the intersectionality score. Okay, so let me just summarize what I've said so far. 1989, Crenshaw originates the concept of intersectionality. In the 30 plus years since, it has become a major subject of study in a variety of fields. It used to be that intersectionality was kind of a political, philosophical idea, but now if you are studying history, if you're studying classics, it's been transported from field to field so that you can study almost any academic subject from an intersectional perspective. So intersectionality postulates that single factors, race, gender, sexuality, cannot adequately account for the diverse identities any individual may possess. Identity is composed of all sorts of sub-identities, which have to do with categories like race, sex, handicap, sexual orientation, class, and so on. Now, as I just mentioned, what's left out of this list are things like intellectual perspective, political views, and religious identification. Those are interestingly thought not to be as important to the intersectional project. One fundamentally important part of all this, though, is the assumption that racism, classism, and heterosexism are structural, not individual. According to the structural account, it's not that you need to be a racist or a sexist as an individual. Rather, these characteristics are inherent in other institutions, in larger institutions. In other words, universities are sexist and racist and patriarchal. Various government agencies are sexist and racist and patriarchal. These are attributes given to large structures. You've heard this, structural racism. So much of this world has come into our common parlance in the last 2 years, really, 1 to 2 years. But the assumption here is that evils like racism and sexism are baked into these agencies, churches, families, universities. A crucial argument of intersectionality is this: institutional power arrangements are rooted in relations of domination and subordination, and therefore they constrict the life possibilities of those who live at the intersection of certain identity categories, and they elevate the possibilities of those living at more privileged points of intersection. One of the benefits of intersectionality is said to be that it avoids the reductiveness of single approaches to oppression. And so with this in mind, we have to, as the intersectional theorists say, reconstitute institutions from the bottom up so that the least advantaged are put first, or at least raised to the level of others. Intersectionality must begin analysis by attending to the most disadvantaged. If you could go down one more slide, there's a very interesting image of equality versus equity. And by now, again, this may be a familiar image to you all. It's as you can see, it's these 3 spectators watching a soccer game, and equality shows, of course, the platforms all the same and the people at different heights, and when people are still left out of being able to watch the game, whereas equity, the platforms themselves are different, which raises everyone up to the same level of being able to appreciate the game. And this is the goal of intersectionality, or of intersectional theorizing, that we do all begin from different places, but what is necessary is to equalize to try to equalize the oppression and privilege, so that if people in the past have had more privilege, then that privilege should be reduced. If they've had less privilege, then they need to be bolstered, given more advantages, so that they can be at the level of the privilege. Let me turn now to just some of the underlying assumptions of intersectionality, and then there will be plenty of time at the end of this presentation to talk more informally, but I just want to lay out a few of these ideas so that you have them when you're thinking about the concept. I think the most important assumption of intersectionality is that human identity is composed of ascriptive characteristics, each of which designates some amount of privilege or oppression. And if you could click down to two slides below, I've written that out. The most important assumption is that human identity is composed of ascriptive characteristics. What are ascriptive characteristics? Well, they're things like race, sex, potentially sexual orientation, class to some extent, that these things that you have not chosen really determine who you are. And they carry with them a measure of privilege and oppression. So white is always, in the American context, more privileged. Black is always less privileged. Male is always more privileged. Female is always less privileged. These things are taken for granted. The second assumption, I think really important assumption, follows from the first. If you could click down one more slide. Social and political life itself is primarily structured by various forms of privilege and oppression. This means that those with privilege intentionally or unintentionally oppress those who do not have it. I'm going to talk more about all 4 of these understandings in just a minute, but I just want to lay them out for you. So again, the first was our identities are composed of these characteristics that we haven't chosen. The second assumption is that political and social life is primarily structured by forms of oppression and privilege. We're not all equal. We cannot operate on the assumption that we're all equal, even morally equal. We are all fundamentally different in terms of privilege and oppression because of these characteristics. And if you click down one more slide, a third assumption, especially here I'm talking about the university, is that the primary goal of wide swath of the academy is to study oneself and one's privilege, or lack of it, with the aim of reforming society to more fairly treat those who have less privilege. In other words, you can't just study history anymore as an account of what happened. You need to have the categories of privilege and oppression right before your eyes as you study history or philosophy or art history or any of the academic disciplines. And then finally, the fourth assumption is also has to do with the university. That the university as a place of retreat from the world is not a valid way of thinking about a university any longer. Universities are and should be centers of political activism. So in other words, you don't go to a university to study the liberal arts and think sort of disinterestedly about life and moral life and religion and all the things that may or may not interest you. You go there to learn how to become a successful activist. So the consequence of all these four, and I'm going to go back to the first one and talk a little bit more about it, and then the second, third, fourth. The consequence of all of this is that intersectional theorists see free human self-understanding as an illusion. They say we are instead determined by our characteristics and by the privilege and oppression that these characteristics carry with them. So let me explain each of these assumptions in turn. And if we want to, we could go back to the first one. This is the one that says human identity is comprised of descriptive characteristics. Let me just explain what I mean there. Intersectionality begins its work on the basis of a debatable, though nobody ever debates it, set of assumptions about personal identity. Identity is assumed to be the product of a set of characteristics. We know what those are: race, gender, class, sexual orientation, ethnicity, and sometimes other things. Weight is another category, attractiveness, age. So these characteristics can go on. Each of these characteristics has a positive or a negative value. And again, as I've said before, male is positive, female is negative, gay is negative, bisexual is negative, straight is positive. And one person has explained it this way. He says, the overarching matrix of domination houses multiple groups, each with various experiences, with penalty and privilege, that produce corresponding partial perspectives and situated knowledge. Okay, I'm sorry, that's not a great quote. But what it means is that think about how this works. You've got a group of white men, you've got a group of white women, but then you've got a group of white lesbian women, you've got a group of black lesbian women. And so you've got all of these groups that are across this matrix of domination, and each of them has a distinct experience of privilege and oppression based on those characteristics. So it goes without saying that many identities stand toward the low end or toward the end that has lots of oppression, but nobody stands at the height of privilege except for white males. So white women and black men, no matter how powerful or wealthy they are always considered from an intersectional point of view disadvantaged. I think one of the problems with this point of view is that it ascribes fixed positive and negative values to each characteristics. Now, it's not true, and people like to criticize the intersectionality quiz because they say that's not taking it seriously enough. It's not simply that white is a +1 or a +10, black is a -1 or a -10. But nobody has any doubt about the factors that contribute to privilege and oppression. I mean, it is never the case that being black could be an advantageous trait that brings with it more privilege. It is never the case that a white male could be oppressed because he's simply in a place where he's full of privilege. So the interesting thing, though, and you all will know this probably having studied at a university, the greater the level of oppression, the more seriously the person's views are taken. So it's kind of an inverse relationship that's come about over the past 10, certainly 5 years. So the more privilege one has, the less that person's voice needs to be heard. which is super interesting. The assumption here is that such a person's privilege has already had its positive effect, and that the person has aimed not just at advancing his own interests, but in harming the people who are below him. I was once at a university meeting, and we had a provost who happened to be a white man, and the thing I remember him saying so clearly was that, well, it is time for all white men to sit down and shut up because they've had their say. And it is time for those who have not had their say to speak. So that's the assumption here, that if you are in a place of privilege or you've had this historical privilege in the past, you need to be silent and let those who have not had those opportunities to speak come forward. Another assumption here is that those with privilege are always actively resisting the people who are trying to better their situation. So white men, and to some extent white women, to some extent black men, are sort of adversaries to those who are beneath them in terms of oppression. They're trying to keep them down. But the oppressed, so this theory goes, are not capable of harming other people because they're in positions of weakness. They can't affect those who are more privileged. And again, this is why in discussions of diversity, white men and again, often white women are told to be quiet and to listen. The second one I'm not going to talk about in detail. This is the social life is structured by a privilege and oppression. Privilege and oppression. I think you understand how that one works. But let me go back to this. The third point: academic study focuses on the self. I think that's a very interesting thing to reflect on, especially in the university context. Mark Lilla is a prominent social theorist, and he wrote a book about identity politics a few years ago. And he's not a conservative. He's definitely a liberal. But even he has bemoaned the tendency of universities to emphasize identity in the way they now do. I don't know if this is true of your experience. It is somewhat true at my own university, not extremely so. It is certainly true at my undergraduate university. It's a very politically activist campus, Oberlin College. And here's what Lilla says about the modern, generally progressive university. He says, at a very young age, our children are being encouraged to talk about their individual identities even before they have them. By the time they reach college, many assume that diversity discourse exhausts political discourse. And they have shockingly little to say about such perennial questions such as class, war, the economy, and the common good. When young people arrive at college, they are encouraged to keep this focus on themselves by student groups, faculty members, and also administrators whose full-time job is to deal with and heighten the significance of diversity issues. The assumption here, I think, and this is me, not Lilla, is that self-identity structures all subsequent academic inquiry and can be transplanted easily to numerous areas where identity studies might not seem so immediately relevant or applicable. So you can certainly understand intersectionality in sociology, in social work, in political science to some extent. But where does intersectionality come into art history? Or where does it come into epistemology? It's there, and I'll give you some examples of titles. Intersectionality has recently appeared in an art history book with the title of Queer Iberia, Sexualities, Cultures, and Crossings from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. And then in philosophy, I recently saw a book called Decentering the Center, Philosophy for a Multicultural, Post-Colonial, and Feminist World. So what's striking here is that this notion that scholarship would be ever disinterested, and by disinterested, of course, I don't mean uninteresting. You may have your own ideas about what's interesting and uninteresting, but there's a way of studying that is what has traditionally been called disinterested, which is, in other words, you're studying, let's say, the political philosophy of Hobbes, not because you want to say that Hobbes has necessarily a direct outcome. His views have an outcome, or that they affect your life. But you're studying Hobbes to know what Hobbes said and to see what kind of illumination into politics he could give you. That is an old-fashioned view from the point of view of intersectionality. It's said to be impossible to have a disinterested view because even according to intersectionality, people who say they're disinterested are actually part of a structure that inadvertently oppresses and privileges certain classes of people. So nobody, say the intersectionality scholars, is actually capable of being disinterested. Finally, the fourth assumption I gave you, universities are meant to foster political activism. I think what comes out here is the notion that universities, and this follows from the last thing I said, it's not about studying disinterestedly the great books or art history or music history or philosophy or any of the other or sciences for that matter, but it's incumbent upon us to link our studies with activism. I mean, and this is not a problem for intersectional theory. It is actually a good. So this view is so much accepted at present that it's now part of the mainstream press. As one writer recently observed in The Atlantic, student activism is widespread, and they say it this way, because some students are making the most of their college experience. They understand that this may very well be the last moment in their lives when they can confront real issues in an environment where they're forced to encounter people who don't look like them, who don't think like them, and an environment where change is still possible. I think what's also striking here is the idea of college not as a kind of apprenticeship, but that you would come to college with already honed views. I mean, you come to college, you know who you are, you know your politics, and I think that's a very backwards way of looking at it. Traditionally in college, what do? You develop your intellectual and emotional capacities. You learn who you are, you take classes you didn't expect to like, you make friends you would have never imagined making friends with in high school. So in my experience, as a teacher now for almost 20 years, and then as a student, it's often the case that you're not the same person at 22 as you were at 18, because you've been exposed to a variety of fields of study and of people who are different from you. And this might mean that you have to rethink or reject some of the preconceptions you came in with. But the problem with thinking about universities as political activism training grounds is that there's little opportunity for this kind of maturing process. And I'd be interested if any of you have comments or have had experiences like this that you would want to share or ask questions about. Because I think the notion that you come to college with your identity already formed perfectly and you're not going to learn anything new, but you're going to go out and be an activist is a really serious misunderstanding. Okay, so those are my underlying assumptions. Let me just summarize a little bit, and then we'll move to questions here and just general discussion, which doesn't have to stay only on the topic of microaggression. I mean, of intersectionality, but we could talk about things like microaggressions or unconscious bias or other ways of conceiving identity politics. But first, let me just summarize. So I think as a group, if we talk about these four assumptions, and again, what they are, human identity is a collection of descriptive characteristics. Everything is within a structure of privilege and oppression. Universities are centers of political activism. These are strangely deterministic and hortatory at once. Okay, what do I mean? They're deterministic in the sense that in intersectionality, we seem to have little freedom to interpret and understand our own situations. This is one of the things that has always bothered me personally about intersectionality. I mean, is not it possible that a woman could see her sex as an advantage rather than a source of oppression? Could a gay person see his or her sexuality as an advantage, not as a source of oppression? In this framework, the answer is always no. At the same time, intersectionality tells us, and I say this is hortatory, or it exhorts us to engage in activism to improve our situations. But only certain kinds of activism are approved, and we know what they are. It would never promote conservative or libertarian activism. And the other problem here is that there's no freedom to think differently from the intersectional theorists themselves. If you are somebody who questions the structural character of oppression and privilege, you are something like a person who questions climate change, somebody who's questioning these dogmas that are so taken for granted. You are beyond the pale of polite society. So that seems to me to be a kind of problem with this framework as a whole. Let me make a few criticisms. You can see that I am generally critical of intersectionality, even as I think, and I do think there's a real truth here. I actually think Crenshaw's article is getting to something that was not sufficiently theorized prior to her article. So in Crenshaw's original formulation, intersectionality fills a gap, which was that law treated certain classes of people, certain fine-grained groups of specially disadvantaged people in ways that harm them as a class. So the criticism, okay, what parts of identity do we include in intersectionality? Well, the theory is helpful, I think, and necessary in certain situations. The truth is, and we've always known this, that human identity is multi-layered and complex. And we've always known this. We've known this for thousands of years, and it's not clear that intersectionality says much new on this score. What it does is assign values of oppression and privilege to each characteristic. But does this yield a better hope of revolutionary change for those who promote the theory? It might, by pointing out the layers and interactions of various kinds of oppression, but then again, it might not. In practice, sometimes intersectionality divides people with various intersectional identities. For example, who should have the greater say, the Black lesbian or the Hispanic transgender person? Can white women ever speak for all women? Or are they just one step removed from the primary oppressors themselves? And think about this. It is not the case that all so-called oppressed people have the same views on social issues. It is I've heard it said that especially older Black Americans are very much more conservative on sexual issues, and yet they're assumed to have sort of intersectional interest with gay people. And all of this is to say we cannot assume views on the basis of characteristics that are supposed to put you in certain categories. I have an interesting image that I'd like to share with you, and I take it from a woman named Helen Lewis, who's a British journalist, and she says this, kind of amusingly. She says, "Are you holding your meeting in a room which isn't accessible to wheelchairs? Congratulations, you just founded an all able-bodied feminist campaign group by default." She continues, "But what about the deaf, the blind? Should a group of feminists starting their own meetup in a university hall enlist someone proficient in sign language in case that's needed? Should they print their leaflets in Braille?" She goes on to observe that she hopes some people will apply some common sense when dealing with these matters in the real world. But again, her comments highlight the divisions that can arise here. What categories should be included in identity? Which ones should be excluded? And what constitutes a good faith effort at inclusion? Couple final thoughts here, and I've already mentioned one of them, is this tendency toward division. The danger is if we continue to ever more fine-grainedly distinguish groups and problematize the character of identity, we find that former coalitions can no longer exist. And this would seem to make political organizing more difficult, not less. Despite Crenshaw's hope in 1991 that awareness of intersectionality would now allow us to better acknowledge and ground the differences among us and negotiate the means by which these differences will find expression in group politics, it is often the case that these differences have not united, but divided. Finally, there's a lot of talk here and not a lot of action. It's not clear that the theory of intersectionality is adequately preparing the ground for the praxis of political change. I wanted to quote a scholar who says, "It's one thing to say that race, gender, sexuality, class, and nation operate interconnectedly, but they are unable to prescribe or imagine points of intervention." So in other words, to just speak in common terms, there has been a great deal of ink expended in writing about this theory in fancy language, but has it yielded the kinds of social, political reforms it originally promised? In large part, the answer is no. It has remained the province of left-leaning academics who often do not engage the broader culture but speak in ways that exclude those who are not already indoctrinated. Now, that was a lot. I would love to take questions to talk about intersectionality, to talk about any other aspect of identity politics, diversity, unconscious bias, microaggression theory. I don't know what kinds of things you all are familiar with, but I'd be very interested in hearing your thoughts about any of this and to hear questions on the idea of intersectionality.
Thank you, Dr. Corey. And I would remind you that you can put your questions in the Q&A sidebar on the right of your screen. So, Dr. Corey, while we're waiting for people to formulate their questions, I just wanted to ask you, I think the original title that I saw for your essay was Intersectionality and the Socialist Temptation. Can you make that link a little bit more clear for us?
Yeah, well, that's interesting because this is actually not a talk about socialism. It's just more a talk about intersectionality. But I think there is a way to make the link, which is that socialism in the contemporary world has become a kind of identity, I think, that people have started to take on and use as a kind of intersectional identity category. I'm not sure it doesn't quite fit in this framework as well as many of the other things, because of course it's one of those things that you could choose. You could say, well, I am a socialist, or I'm not a socialist, or I am a capitalist, or I'm a libertarian, or whatever. But there's a way in which certain people have said, well, I am a socialist, and by virtue of the fact that I am oppressed. I'm not taken seriously by political actors, and this is a way of saying, I deserve a greater platform in the public conversation than I have been given in the past, because socialists have been condemned, communists have been condemned, and in fact, it's a perfectly legitimate way of, conducting one's politics, and its voice needs to be heightened. I think that's kind of the short answer to how socialism would fit into this framework.
Okay, now I think I have an example of, I guess from my personal perspective, the kinds of problems this creates for human relationships. I see the legitimacy of the original case which spurred this, the black women at General Motors. But as a framework for interpreting all human interaction, that there's never an interaction where we approach it as equals, but always, on an unlevel playing field, especially where we disagree about ideas. The example I have in mind is I have somebody I know who believes very strongly in this theory, and she was listening to a mutual friend who was saying, whether or not we should have this or that public policy. And she noticed it was the gender of the two people talking. And she was not so interested in the idea as the way the man was talking to the woman. And then the man would talk to me and it would be different. And so she realized the whole conversation, oh, isn't it interesting how he talked to her, which was different than how he talked to you. And she interpreted his intentions, his mind, his whole attitude about her, mainly because of their gender or their sex. And so I'm wondering, is that an example of how intersectionality theory would play a role in judging who's right and who's wrong?
That's so interesting to me, because look, think about it. I mean, and I asked the audience this too. I know that over the past 5 to 10 years, I have become intensely conscious of all the identity characteristics of the people I talk to on a daily basis. So that if I am talking to a Hispanic man, I have a colleague who's Hispanic. He's a Hispanic American, but he's very much invested in his Hispanic identity. And I am very, very careful to never say anything that I imagine could possibly offend him, because I have seen him get angry at people for saying the wrong thing that is perceived as insensitive to him. And of course, I'm absolutely for politeness and for civility. But what it does is that it puts you on just, tender hooks. You're never sure of what is an acceptable thing to say to anybody in a way that you might, such that you don't offend them in terms of their identity characteristics. So I do think, and it sounds like in the situation you're talking about, there's a tendency to say, well, because of somebody's sex or because of somebody's race, that is why that person is talking to me or to someone else in this way, when it might just be the case that, you've completely misunderstood who this person is and why he or she is talking in the way he or she is talking. There's just a kind of assumption that you know so much about others based on their identity characteristics, which I think is very, very dangerous.
Yeah.
And let me say one other thing along those lines. I had thought today about talking a little bit more about microaggressions, and I'm sure you all are familiar with this term, but it's a vital part of all diversity trainings. And the premise of it is that the people who are more privileged, certainly white men, probably white women, commit microaggressions against people who are less privileged, Black men or women, Hispanic, Asian, anybody non-white. And we do this in ways all the time that we don't see ourselves, but the people who receive them do see. But they are unconscious to the term is the person who delivers a microaggression is a perpetrator. The person who receives a microaggression is a victim. The problem here, of course, is always that the perpetrator, as that person is called, may or may not have had that intention to harm or to do anything wrong at all. But the victim is given complete interpretive freedom to decide whether or not a microaggression has been committed, which I think is a very dangerous position to put human interaction into, where one person gets full interpretive freedom, the other person has no ability to defend himself, because it's all assumed to be in a kind of unconscious realm that you don't even know when you're being a microaggressor, and it's up to the victim to point it out to you. So I guess the reason I bring that up here is that there's a notion that we know so much about other people and other people's motivations on the basis of these traits that we can observe, like sex and race, or maybe sexual orientation. And I think that's a very dangerous view to take, because people are surprising. People understand themselves in ways that might not be the way you think they do. And that's one of the problems, I think, with the intersectional framework, that it assumes everyone with X trait is oppressed, everyone with Y trait is an oppressor and full of privilege. And that is just simply not the case. Not always the case.
Okay. So we have a question from Callista here. She says, could you please comment on bias when it comes to hiring job candidates and how companies can mitigate that hiring bias? There's a little application question here.
Yes, could you say the question again? You cut out right as you were asking the question.
Sure. Would you comment, please, on hiring bias, discrimination in the workplace, and how we can mitigate that?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. At my university, we've just been asked to undergo a training in order to increase diversity. I haven't taken the training yet, so I don't know what it will be. I think the premise behind imperatives to increase hiring diversity and to increase underrepresented minorities, whether those be sexual or racial minorities, is that we need to do everything possible to diversify the faculty. So let's just take a university. This is true across industries, of course, but we need to diversify the faculty so that the faculty represent the population at large. So if we have 60% women in a university, we need to have 60% women professors to reflect that. That's a kind of underlying assumption. I think that, and so what's being asked there is that in hiring, we look for candidates who are part of these underrepresented categories, and we do everything possible to find those candidates and to bring them to our universities and then to retain them. I know for a fact that every single university in this country, maybe not Hillsdale College, but almost every other university is trying very, very hard to recruit and retain talented minorities and women. What is interesting to me is that on the searches I've ended up on, there is actually kind of a there has come into play a reverse prejudice against white men, which I think is problematic. Because what it means is that the committee will sit around and say, oh, we've got a great group of candidates, so-and-so has this qualification and these teaching recommendations and these articles, and then there's always the but he's a white man. And so-and-so has this stuff, and she is a black woman, therefore we will automatically defer to her. Now, the understanding of why that happens is that she represents a class that has been historically discriminated against, and I think there's a lot to that. But therefore, in the individual case, we're always going to choose the diverse candidate over the white male candidate, and that's problematic in the particular, because I mean, I guess what I want to say is why does the white man deserve that kind of discrimination on the basis of class or race any more than the black woman does? Why could we not try simply to assess them both on a reasonably fair set of criteria? But I could see somebody, I mean, I know people who are very bought into the intersectional framework and say, yeah, it doesn't matter. Too bad for that guy.
He is privileged and has been for generations, and so why should we feel sorry for him?
That's exactly what people say. The problem in the concrete is that it may be the case that this, again, the guy has come up from utter poverty in who knows where, and has worked very hard all his life to get there. I mean, we don't know those sorts of things. So to make assumptions that he's been privileged on that basis, on the basis of his skin color, is problematic.
I have to say that I have experienced this myself as a white male. I have a funny story to share with you. Perhaps I can share it with all of you now. This has been going on for some time. This is not a recent development. My very first job interview, I went to the interview and I was told, "Oh, I'm sorry, we can't hire you. We're looking for a woman." This was 1990. And I know this, this was 31 years ago. So I'm wondering how long will it take, or how long do the intersectional theorists believe it will take in order to level the playing field? Will it be my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren? At what point do we start treating people perhaps equally privileged?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question and very hard to answer. For this reason, if you think this through, there's a very cynical way of looking at intersectionality, which is that it's not really about leveling the playing field. It's about getting power and keeping power. Because if you think about what it does, it inverts the power relationship so that the formerly privileged white men, white women, black men, are deprived of the power they've had and have wielded for all these years, and the people who've not had it are now getting it, and they can wield this kind of power. So my question is, why would they want to give up that power and get to some sort of level playing field where everybody is treated equally? I mean, and that's why I say it's cynical, because if you are one of those people who, by virtue of sex or race, is traditionally less privileged and more oppressed, but right now has a voice that is kind of outsized importance, why would you want to get rid of that? So I don't know that there is a desire of a level playing field, because then we'd all have to kind of not talk about race and sex and sexual orientation so much. We just have to kind of relate to each other. And that is, I think a lot of conservatives are frustrated by that, because they think that's where I want to be. But progressives see that, well, wait a minute, we're getting power here, and we don't necessarily want to give up that power. Let me say, from a kind of self-interest perspective, there are many things that I can say as a woman. I hate the phrase, as a woman, because it excludes other people from interacting with me. But there are many things I can say as a woman that my husband, who's a man, could never say. Never. Because he would be accused of, exerting his white male privilege. For me, it's white female, but that's not quite as bad.
Okay, we've got a question from Bob Love here. He says, how can those of us who do not suffer from intersectional traits converse efficiently when discussing diversity, equity, and inclusion with people who have bought into this ideology? By the way, this is a common question I get from many of my students. I have to tell you, at Northwood University, our system may be a little different, but for those who have transferred to Northwood from other schools, I hear these stories about what they've been taught. And it really does match the description you gave of the university as an activist training ground. And so I hear a version of this question all the time from my students. How do we converse with people who have bought into this ideology if we ourselves are not intersectional or don't agree with that perspective?
I'm afraid I don't have a good answer for that. I mean, here, one practical way I have seen white men at my own university try to deal with this is to say, well, I'm becoming an ally to those who are less privileged. I may be white and I may be male and I may have this historical privilege, but what I can do, and you hear about this in, I think it's Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, you can become an ally to those people who have been oppressed. And you can say, I understand what you've been through. I understand that you're coming from a place that is not as privileged as mine. I'm not sure what that looks like, but I know that this is a line that I do hear from progressive white men on campus. They say, my job here is to be an ally to you. Now, to be cynical again, I have another friend at another university who says, if they were real allies, they would put their money where their mouth is and give up their jobs and make way for a more diverse workforce, or just say, yeah, I'm a white man. As a result, I need to be, phasing out. I need to get a more inclusive and representative group of people in, so I need to step aside. Now, how many times do people do that? Not often. So in a way, the answer to Bob Love's question is, I'm not sure, because this framework has gone so far from being just in the university that it really structures our entire social world at this point. And I think the only thing you can do is I face this to some extent, to try to be kind and courteous and charitable toward other people's experiences, and try to express your views in a way that is not mean or aggressive, and hope that they will listen. But beyond that, I don't know to what extent you're able to affect change, because once you're in this world, it's very hard to get people out of it.
Mm-hmm. The slide you use describing the difference between equality and equity, I'm interested to know what you think of that analogy, the fence. I think there's a lot to be unpacked there, because when you see the slide, I think there's a strong positive emotional response to that. And the pursuit of equity is something I think that we all intuitively believe in. Of course, the short person should get the taller stool. Beyond soccer games, though, what does on a practical level, what is it that intersectionality really expects us to do with respect to those who are intersectional? How do we promote this equity specifically?
Yeah, it's very interesting, and it's interesting that you take that slide as a point of jumping off, because that slide is it's a very powerful slide, and it's used in all sorts of trainings across universities and companies and so on. It's what is it? It kind of appeals to our intuitive sense of we ought to treat people so that they have equal opportunities, and I believe that certainly most Americans do think that. But it's one thing to put a stool of the right size under people's feet. What we would have to ask to answer your question is, well, what is that stool? What exactly are we supposed to be doing that would prop up the person so that he or she would be able to stand at the level of the other person? And some of it may be simple things like, I am, for the record, not anti-diversity. I would love to have a diverse, not always for its own sake. I think there are other goods to be pursued too in universities, but to the extent we include every applicant who is qualified and good, I'm totally for that. But what if those little stools mean you are giving advantage to people who have not earned the advantage for whatever reason? Is that fair? I mean, this is a very contentious thing to say, but ought you to hire somebody who is not as qualified as the tall guy over there? You've got the slide up again. But you think that the history of that person has put that person in a place that you ought to give some not benefit of the doubt, but some special privileges. I mean, I think that's where the American notion of, well, you got to work for it, you got to work hard, and things are not always fair comes into conflict with, we want things to be fair as much as possible. We want people to not be treated differently on the basis of their skin color, their sex.
Yeah, our previous speaker today, Colonel West, told about one of his privileges. As he was a young man, he had parents who were very interested in his getting the right education. And
oh yeah,
he had parents who took him out of his public school, which was underperforming, and put him in a private school. And the other thing that he mentioned was he had parents. He had two parents. So, there are all kinds of privileges that we have,
yes.
Such as growing up in a two-parent household, having parents who read to us when we're small. So how far does intersectional theory go into leveling the opportunity between those people?
Well, yeah, the positive side of this is that interventions begin, early on in the school system, and we do everything we can to make the opportunities the same for everyone, regardless of their family structure, any sort of incidental disadvantages or advantages they have. But I've actually heard people go so far as to say, I think there was an article, I can't remember where it was, but a guy made the claim that because many parents now don't read to their children, affluent, well-educated parents ought not to read to their children either, so that they would not have an unfair advantage. I think that is utter craziness, that you would harm your own.
Far from what President Hollande of France actually proposed, which was the abolition of homework. I'm sure he was very popular with French school children, but it was the same argument. How can you possibly give two children homework when one of them has a parent at home who's willing to make sure that they do it and the other doesn't?
Yes.
And to me, that seems like what's wrong with that argument? Why is that such a bad idea?
Well, what's the ultimate end of that argument? You'd almost have to get to a sort of Platonic, raise all children in common so that you don't ever advantage anybody on the basis of family structure. There's a point at which you come up against this, we want fairness, we want to be good and equitable to the extent we can as a society, but there are differences in the choices people make. And this gets to this core idea of freedom. Some families freely choose to do everything they can for their kids, and it sounds like, I'm sure Cornel West's family did that. Some families do not do that, and their children unfairly suffer for that. Are we going to go in as a state and enforce, that the irresponsible family do the right thing. We want to encourage that, but I don't think we can enforce that. And then what it does yield is very inequitable outcomes. I had a friend for a while who is exactly my age. He is a contractor. He grew up in a family where he had no personal attention. His parents were very poor. They had very little education. He got very little education. And he's now my age and has had a very tough and bad life. And I remember just feeling the injustice of that and saying, why did I get parents who read to me and he didn't get that? Why do I have this? And I do have privilege, of course, everyone does to some extent or other. Why do I have these privileges and he has not these privileges? And I just remember feeling this is what drives this project. It is a real human good to try to improve people's situation. But I don't think you can go all the way back and fix everything, even to the point of the family. Some, you're given advantages, you're given disadvantages that you did not ask for.
Right. It's
sort of
yeah. One of the, I think, the problems with the homework example or the reading example or the family example is, there's no way to create equity there that I could think of without separating the role of the parents from raising the child. If you could give us all the same childhood in the same family structure, that would be one thing, but that doesn't seem possible.
No, and there's also this wonderful thing called freedom where people actually want to make their own choices.
Yeah.
And some of them have good consequences and some of them don't.
So I have another question. This one is with respect to healthcare. There are disparities in the healthcare industry. What should we do to fix these healthcare disparities? I'm thinking of increased rates of HIV in the LGBT and low-income communities, and people not having access to preventive care. And then there's some more, but I can't. It looks like it cut off there.
Yeah, health policy is not my world, so I don't know, practically speaking, what the answer to this is. I will say, though, that I think that your question points at something that is really important just in the context of what we've been talking about. I said, my friend who's my age and has had this very tough life because he didn't have a stable family growing up. Health care is a similar kind of advantage or disadvantage. And now some countries have very different situations and ways of dealing with this. Canada, the UK, and people love those. Some people love them, others don't. I know Canadians both who love the system and who said, if I'm going to get a surgery, I'm going to come to the United States. But the point is, there's a kind of basic level of healthcare, I think, that is provided by certain countries that probably does go quite a ways toward a certain kind of equality. And that we don't have that is certainly exacerbates the kind of inequality. I think that the equity slide is trying to make better. So, health is just yet another of these kind of advantages, disadvantages, privileges, lack of privilege. And again, there though, think about it. Healthcare would be, some kind of universal base care would be a very good thing, I think. But some people are born with genetic diseases, and some of us have, immune problems, and some of us have a family history of cancer, and some of us are super healthy, and some of us are, these are not things that we can sort of take in hand and fix either. We can try to ameliorate them as best we can, but I don't think we're going to come to a place where even the best healthcare system is going to get rid of those disparities in the way that many of us would like.
But what I detect in your answer is maybe a different type of solution in the case of healthcare or childcare that you mentioned, compared to banishing homework example, where in the one case, we promote equity by preventing advantages from developing.
Right.
And in the second case, we are actually attempting to correct some disadvantages that people experience.
Yeah. No, it's very different.
Most people would agree that, helping people with some kind of disadvantage is preferable.
Yes.
Okay, so we've actually come to the end of our session. If you have more questions, please consider visiting our discussion boards, our online discussion community at Yellow Dig, where we can get into these topics a little bit deeper. And I want to thank you again, Dr. Corey, for being with us and talking about intersectionality. It was a very informative presentation. Thank you all
Thank you
for
so much
joining
for
us.
having me.